The air in Istanbul was a physical assault. It was not the crisp, pine-scented air of the Rhodope Mountains he had known for all 12 years of his life, but a thick, greasy soup of humanity and decay. It smelled of charcoal smoke, of unwashed bodies pressed close, of salt and fish from the Golden Horn, and beneath it all, the pervasive Swedish stench of sewage baking in the summer sun. For the boy whose name was still Stoyan, though he was learning with every lash and every hungry night to forget it, the city was not a jewel of an empire but a monster's gullet, and he was being marched inexorably into its belly. He, along with 200 other boys, was the latest harvest, the human tax levied upon the Christian provinces of the Balkans. They were the div serm, the collection, a term that sounded like the gathering of crops, but felt like the reaping of souls. Their march had been a blur of dust, fear, and the rhythmic chafing of ropes on their wrists. But the arrival was a new kind of horror, a sensory drowning that promised a suffocation far slower and more complete than any physical death. How does a child, whose world was defined by the curve of a familiar hill and the sound of his mother's voice, comprehend the sheer, brutal scale of this new reality? The answer is that he does not. He simply endures, moment by terrifying moment, as his old self is systematically ground to dust. This is not merely the story of a single child's tragedy, but an examination of a chillingly effective imperial machine. The Ottoman Empire, in its relentless pursuit of stability and power, had devised a solution to the perennial problem of ambitious nobility and entrenched regional loyalties. It would create a new class of servant, a slave elite, utterly dependent on and fanatically loyal to a single source of power, the Sultan himself. To do this, the empire institutionalized a practice of breathtaking cruelty and sociological genius. It would harvest the brightest, strongest, and most handsome sons from its Christian subjects, severing them from family, faith, land, and language. These boys would be taken to the heart of the empire, converted to Islam, and forged in the fires of a rigorous, abusive, and all-consuming education. They were to become the janissaries, the elite infantry who knew no family but their corps, and the palace administrators and grand viziers, men whose every ambition was channeled into the service of the state that had stolen their lives. The story of Stoyan is the story of this process, a look into the dark alchemy required to transmute a free boy into a perfect slave, and the terrible, unspoken truth that the most perfect slave is the one who eventually learns to love his chains and, in time, learns to forge them for others. Before the arrival of the crimson-bannered officials, Stoyan's life had been one of textured simplicity, rich in the ways that mattered. His village was a cluster of stone and timber houses nestled in a gentle valley, shielded by the ancient, brooding mountains. His days were measured by the sun and the seasons. He knew the weight of a full pail of milk, the sharp joy of the first spring thaw, the scent of wild herbs his mother, Elena, gathered on the hillsides. His father, a man named Stefan, was broad-shouldered and quiet, his hands calloused from the plow and the axe, but his eyes held a deep, steady affection for his firstborn son. Stoyan was learning the rhythms of the land from him, how to read the clouds for rain, how to find the oldest oaks in the forest, how to soothe a nervous lamb. He had a younger sister, Anna, whose laughter was like a string of tiny bells, and a baby brother, still in the cradle. His world was circumscribed but complete. It was a life of obligation and love, of orthodox faith chanted in a small, smoky church, and of stories told by the fireside, tales of Bulgarian kings and forest spirits. He was a boy deeply rooted in his soil, his family, and his identity. He was Stoyan, son of Stefan, a Bulgarian, a Christian, a child of the mountains. Every one of those identifiers was a cord that bound him to his existence, and the machine that was coming for him was designed to sever them all, one by one, with surgical precision. The subject peoples of the Ottoman Balkans lived under a tense and fragile peace. The initial shock of conquest had passed into a generational reality of subjugation. Taxes were paid, officials were deferred to, and life went on under the shadow of a power that was alien in faith and language. But of all the burdens placed upon the Christian Raya, none was as dreaded as the Divserm. It was not a yearly occurrence, but its unpredictability was part of its terror. It might skip a generation, allowing a fragile hope to grow, only to return with the force of a natural disaster. The Sultan's agents, the Aga and his soldiers, would arrive without warning, and the village would be compelled to present all its male children between the ages of 8 and 20. The selection was a horrific spectacle. The boys were stripped, examined like livestock for strength, intelligence, and physical perfection. A handsome face, a strong back, a quick mind, the very qualities a parent would cherish, became marks of doom. The logic from the Ottoman perspective was cold and unassailable. By taking the best, they not only fortified their own state, but also systematically drained the subject populations of their future leaders, their potential rebels, their strongest hearts. It was a slow-motion cultural evisceration, ensuring that the provinces remained docile and dependent. For the families, it was a recurring nightmare made real, a grief without a grave, as their sons were not killed but stolen, destined to be raised as the very instruments of their people's oppression. The day the machine came for Stoyan began like any other. The sun was warm on the stones of the village square, and the air hummed with the sound of bees in the clover. He was helping his father mend a fence when the cry went up, a sound of alarm that cut through the pastoral peace. At the edge of the village, a column of riders appeared, their red banners stark against the green landscape. A collective paralysis seized the villagers. It was them, the takers of boys. Stefan gripped Stoyan's shoulder, his knuckles white. "Go to your mother," he rasped, his voice tight with a terror Stoyan had never heard before. "Hide." But there was nowhere to hide. The soldiers were methodical, fanning out through the village, their movements practiced and impersonal. Doors were kicked in. Families were dragged into the square. The village priest protested, holding his cross aloft, and was struck down with the flat of a sword. The selection began. Stoyan was wrenched from his mother's arms, her screams tearing at the fabric of the sky. He was pushed into a line with other boys, trembling and weeping. The Aga, a man with eyes as cold and gray as river stones, walked down the line. He stopped in front of Stoyan. He tilted the boy's chin up, studied his face, ran a hand over his shoulders and back. He spoke a few words in Turkish to a scribe. A soldier stepped forward and grabbed Stoyan's arm. That was it. His life, the one he knew, was over. He looked back and saw his father, a man of immense physical strength, standing utterly broken, his face a mask of impotent fury and bottomless despair. He saw his mother collapse to the ground, a small, dark heap of grief. That image of his powerful father rendered helpless and his loving mother destroyed would become the first ghost to haunt the long nights of his new life. The journey to Istanbul was the first stage of his unmaking. Stoyan and the other chosen boys were tied together in a long, shuffling coffle, a human chain of misery winding its way across the plains and hills of Thrace. The world he had known shrank to the dusty heels of the boy in front of him and the constant, abrasive pressure of the rope on his skin. The guards were janissaries, men who had likely begun their lives in villages just like his. Yet, there was no flicker of recognition or empathy in their eyes. They were products of the same system, and their hardness was a testament to its success. They drove the boys with whips and curses, offering little food and less water. The first lesson of survival was learned quickly. Weakness was a death sentence. A boy who stumbled and could not rise was left behind for the wolves. A boy who wept too loudly was silenced with a blow. Complaint was met with casual brutality. The shared trauma should have bonded them, but fear is a poor foundation for fellowship. Instead, suspicion began to curdle their shared misery. A crust of bread, hoarded and hidden, could be stolen in the night. A moment of kindness could be interpreted as a weakness to be exploited later. Stoyan learned to be silent, to watch, to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. He learned the geography of cruelty, memorizing the faces of the guards who were lazy, the ones who were sadistic, and the rare one who might ignore a minor transgression. He felt his grief for his family begin to recede, not because it lessened, but because it was a luxury he could not afford. It was a heavy stone that threatened to pull him under, so he let it sink into the cold, dark depths of his memory, where it would wait for him. Along the march, the process of indoctrination began. They were forbidden from speaking their native tongue. A Bulgarian word would earn a lash. They were given new, Turkish names. Stoyan refused to answer to the name he was given, Murad, and for his defiance, he was flogged until he was unconscious. When he awoke, the pain was a searing reminder of his powerlessness. The next time the guard called Murad, a broken whisper escaped Stoyan's lips. It was a surrender, and it felt like a part of him had died. Their Christian faith was systematically dismantled. Priests had been brought along for the first part of the journey, ostensibly to comfort them, but their real purpose was to perform a final, ceremonial severing. In a grim parody of last rites, they were told that their old life was over, that they were now bound for a new and greater destiny in service to the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth. They were told to forget their parents, for the Sultan was now their father. They were told to forget their God, for a new and more powerful one awaited them. Some boys clung to their crosses, whispering prayers in the dark, but soon even these small acts of defiance were rooted out. Crosses were ripped from their necks and trampled into the dust. The journey was a physical ordeal, but its true purpose was psychological. It was a methodical erosion of self, a way of breaking them down into their constituent parts, fear, hunger, pain, so that they could be reassembled later into something entirely new. After weeks that felt like a lifetime, they saw the walls of Constantinople. They were not the majestic sight a free traveler might behold, but a looming cage of stone and mortar. The city did not welcome them. It swallowed them. They were herded through the Adrianople Gate, their arrival barely noticed by the teeming crowds who saw such human tribute as a routine fact of imperial life. The boys, gaunt, filthy, and terrified, were taken to a series of courtyards near the palace complex. Here, the final selection would take place. They were stripped naked once more, their bodies now thin and covered in sores and bruises from the journey. They stood shivering, exposed and humiliated, as a new set of officials, palace eunuchs, and high-ranking tutors conducted the final inspection. This was a far more discerning appraisal than the one in the village. They were looking for more than just raw strength. They were looking for the spark of intelligence in an eye, for graceful proportions, for an indefinable quality that suggested potential for the highest echelons of power. It was a terrifying, silent auction where the currency was a boy's entire future. The most physically powerful would be sent to the Janissary Corps to be molded into soldiers. The less promising would be assigned to menial labor or apprenticed to artisans. But the best, the most handsome, the most intelligent, the most promising were destined for the Enderun, the palace school. It was considered the greatest of honors, a path that could lead to the highest offices in the empire. Stoyan, now answering to Murad, was chosen for the Enderun. He did not know whether to feel relief or a deeper dread. He was separated from the remaining boys he had marched with and led into the inner sanctums of the Topkapi Palace. The opulence was dizzying. He walked through courtyards of intricate tilework, past bubbling fountains and gardens heavy with the scent of jasmine and roses. It was a world of impossible beauty, but it felt as threatening as the squalor of the city streets. This beauty was a cage, too, just a more gilded one. He was handed over to the care of the white eunuchs, the spectral figures who governed the palace school. They were men who had been stripped of their own manhood, and they presided over the unmaking and remaking of these boys with a chilling, dispassionate efficiency. Murad was given his first bath in weeks, a rough scrubbing that felt more like an act of purification than of cleansing. His ragged clothes were burned. He was dressed in the simple silk uniform of a novice page, an ikaglan. He was then subjected to the final, irrevocable act of transformation, the forced circumcision and conversion. In a sterile, impersonal ceremony, his foreskin was cut, and he was made to recite the Shahada, the declaration of faith that made him a Muslim. As the words, alien and meaningless, left his lips, Stoyan felt the last tether to his old self snap. Stoyan, the Bulgarian boy from the mountains, was now well and truly dead. In his place stood Murad, a novice of the Enderun, a slave of the Sultan, a ghost in a strange and beautiful prison. The Enderun school was not an institution of learning in the way a free mind would understand it. It was a crucible. The official curriculum was impressive, designed to create Renaissance men in service of an absolute monarch. The boys learned to read and write Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. They studied calligraphy, mathematics, law, theology, and music. They were trained in horsemanship, archery, and the art of war. They were groomed to be poets, administrators, strategists, and courtiers. But beneath this veneer of high culture ran a darker, unwritten curriculum, the art of survival in a predatory hierarchy. The school was organized into a rigid system of chambers, or odas, with boys progressing from the lowest to the highest as they aged and proved their worth. Advancement was everything, and it was a zero-sum game. The success of one boy often meant the failure of another. This system was deliberately designed to foster intense rivalry, to atomize the boys and prevent them from forming any bonds of solidarity that might challenge the authority of their masters. Friendship was a dangerous liability. Trust was a fool's gambit. Every peer was a potential rival. Every superior, a potential patron or tormentor. The psychological toll of this environment was immense. The boys were under constant, unremitting scrutiny. Every action, every word, every glance was noted and judged. A display of weakness, a moment of emotional vulnerability, could lead to brutal punishment or, worse, demotion and disgrace. The ever-present threat of violence was a tool of control. The eunuchs and senior pages wielded their authority with absolute power. Beatings were common for the slightest infraction, but the most insidious form of control was psychological. The boys were relentlessly reminded of their slave status, their utter dependence on the Sultan's favor. Their past lives were systematically erased. Any mention of their families or former homes was forbidden and severely punished. They were taught to see their abduction not as a tragedy, but as an act of supreme grace, a gift from the Sultan who had rescued them from a life of ignorant peasant toil. This constant, pervasive propaganda created a profound cognitive dissonance. To survive, a boy had to accept the lie. He had to learn to express gratitude for his own violation, to see his captors as his saviors. This warping of reality was perhaps the most damaging abuse of all, for it forced the victim to become complicit in his own dehumanization. Murad learned to navigate this treacherous world with the same silent watchfulness he had cultivated on the long march. He buried the ghost of Stoyan so deep that even he could barely hear its whispers. He excelled in his studies, his mind sharp and hungry for the knowledge that was both his prison and his only path to a less painful existence. He learned to compose poetry that praised the Sultan's greatness, his hand steady as he wrote the elegant script. He learned to fight with a cold, detached efficiency, his body becoming a weapon. He learned to dissemble, to wear a mask of placid obedience while his mind was a whirlwind of calculation. He saw what happened to boys who failed to adapt. He saw them broken by the casual cruelty, their spirits extinguished. He saw others fall prey to the predatory desires of older pages or powerful officials, their bodies used as currency for protection or advancement. The palace was rife with these unspoken currents of exploitation, a reality that the beautiful tile work and fragrant gardens could not conceal. Murad learned to make himself unappealing as prey. He developed a coldness, an aloofness that kept others at a distance. He focused all his energy on one thing: advancement. It was the only way out, the only way to gain a measure of control over his own life. He began to see the other boys not as fellow sufferers, but as obstacles on a board, pieces to be navigated around or, if necessary, removed. The empathy he might have once felt had been cauterized by fear and ambition. His internal world became a fortress. In the dead of night, when the palace was silent save for the footfalls of the guards, the ghost would sometimes return. He would see his mother's face, crumpled in grief. He would feel the phantom grip of his father's hand on his shoulder. He would smell the phantom scent of wood smoke and rain-soaked earth. These memories were agonizing, shards of a broken life. In the early years, they would bring silent tears that he would hastily wipe away, terrified of being seen. But as time went on, he learned to treat these memories as a weakness, a dangerous sentimentality. He began to resent them, to resent the boy named Stoyan for his softness. Stoyan was a victim. Murad could not afford to be a victim, and so he began a conscious effort to kill the ghost within him. He poured himself into his Islamic studies, finding a cold comfort in the fatalistic certainty of the theology. He drove himself to exhaustion in his military training, using physical pain to drown out the emotional. He started to internalize the Enderun's ideology. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps he had been chosen for greatness. Perhaps the pain was a necessary fire to burn away the dross of his peasant origins. This line of thinking was a balm, a poison that soothed the wound even as it corrupted him from within. He was slowly becoming the perfect product of the system, a man whose only identity was his function, whose only loyalty was to power. The turning point in his transformation from victim to predator came in his 7th year at the Enderun. Murad, now nearly 20, was a senior page in the chamber of the campaign, a position of considerable trust and privilege. He was no longer a boy, but a young man, hardened and polished by the relentless pressures of the school. He had a patron, a powerful vizier named Yusuf Pasha, a man who had also come through the Devserm system and saw in Murad a reflection of his own ruthless ambition. Yusuf Pasha had taken an interest in Murad's career, but his favor was not without its price. It required absolute loyalty and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to advance their shared interests. A new batch of boys had recently arrived at the palace, fresh from the provinces, their faces still holding the ghost of terror that Murad remembered so well. Among them was a boy named Alan, a bright, gentle youth from the hills of Bosnia. Alan reminded Murad of himself, or rather, of the Stoyan he had tried so hard to bury. The boy was talented in music and had a guileless nature that made him both endearing and dangerously vulnerable. Another powerful faction at court, rivals of Yusuf Pasha, had also taken notice of Alan. They saw his talent as a way to gain favor with the Sultan, who was a great lover of music. Alan was becoming a pawn in a much larger game. Yusuf Pasha summoned Murad to his private chambers. The air was thick with incense and the unspoken weight of political intrigue. The vizier did not waste time with pleasantries. The Bosnian boy, Alan, he began, his voice a low murmur. He is becoming a problem. His patrons are my enemies. His success would be their success, and my inconvenience, he paused, his dark eyes fixed on Murad. He needs to be removed. Not killed, that would be crude. Disgraced. An accusation of theft, a rumor of seditious talk, something that will taint him irrevocably. The command was clear. Murad was being asked to destroy a boy who was the embodiment of the innocence he himself had lost. He was being asked to become the faceless cruelty that had once shattered his own life. It was a test. Yusuf Pasha was not just asking for an act of political sabotage. He was asking Murad to prove that he had fully shed the skin of his past, that no sentimental weakness remained. He was asking him to prove that he was no longer the collected, but one of the collectors. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, the ghost of Stoyan rose up within him. He saw the terrified face of the boy in the village square. He saw the line of weeping children. He saw Alan's trusting eyes, and a wave of profound sickness washed over him. This was the abyss. He could refuse, hold on to some last, tattered scrap of the boy he once was. But he knew what that would mean. He would lose Yusuf Pasha's patronage. His own meticulously constructed career would crumble. He would be cast back down into the anonymous mass of palace servants, his future erased, forever vulnerable to the whims of men like Yusuf Pasha. He looked at the vizier, at the man's cold, expectant face, and saw his own future. Power, security, the ability to be the one who commands, not the one who is commanded. The world of the Enderun had taught him one lesson above all others. Empathy is suicide. Compassion is a weapon used against you. The world is a brutal, unforgiving place, and the only way to survive is to be more brutal than the rest. He remembered his father's powerless rage, and a cold fire ignited in his gut. He would never be powerless again. He made his choice. He bowed his head to the vizier. "It will be done, Pasha," he said, and his voice was steady, devoid of any emotion. In that moment, Stoyan of the Rodopi Mountains breathed his last. Murad, the creature of the palace, had finally and completely taken his place. The plan was simple and vicious. Murad used his position of seniority to gain Alan's trust. He offered the younger boy guidance, praised his musical talent, and made him feel protected. Alan, starved for kindness in this brutal environment, latched onto Murad with grateful devotion. It was his trust that Murad would use as his weapon. During a palace festival, when security was focused on the Sultan's reception, Murad planted a valuable jeweled dagger, a gift to Yusuf Pasha from a foreign emissary, among Alan's meager belongings. He then went to the captain of the White Eunuchs and, with an expression of feigned reluctance and deep regret, reported that he had seen Alan acting suspiciously near the Pasha's chambers. The search was inevitable and the outcome preordained. The dagger was found. Alan's protestations of innocence were dismissed as the predictable lies of a thief. His talent, his youth, his gentle nature, none of it mattered. He was a slave, and he had been accused by a senior page with a powerful patron. There would be no trial. The punishment was swift and terrible. Alan was not executed, for as Yusuf Pasha had said, that would be crude. He was subjected to the falaka, his feet beaten to a bloody pulp with rods, a punishment designed to inflict excruciating pain and permanent disgrace. Then, broken and sobbing, he was expelled from the Enderun and sold into hard labor in the shipyards of Galata, a fate worse than a quick death. Murad watched the punishment from a distance, his face an impassive mask. He felt nothing, or rather, he felt a chilling emptiness, a void where his revulsion should have been. The part of him that would have recoiled in horror was gone, surgically excised by years of conditioning. He saw not a suffering child, but the removal of an obstacle. He had been given a task, and he had completed it with ruthless efficiency. That night, Yusuf Pasha sent for him again. There was a look of grim approval in the old vizier's eyes. He did not mention Alan's name. He simply gestured for Murad to sit. "You have a promising future," Yusuf Pasha said. "You understand the nature of power. It is not a gift. It is a tool, and it must be wielded without sentiment." A small, exquisitely crafted ring was placed on the table. "A mark of my favor," the Pasha continued. "Your time in the school is nearing its end. I will see to it that your first posting is a worthy one." Murad picked up the ring. It was cold and heavy. It was the price of a boy's soul, the price of his own. He slipped it onto his finger. It fit perfectly. He had passed the final, unspoken test of the Enderun. He had proven he was willing to become the monster to escape being its prey. He was now, truly, part of the machine. In the years that followed, Murad's ascent was swift. As promised, Yusuf Pasha secured him a prestigious position in the imperial bureaucracy upon his graduation from the palace school. He left the confines of the Enderun behind, but he carried its lessons with him. He was no longer Murad the page, but Murad Bey, the rising official in the divan. He was intelligent, diligent, and utterly ruthless. He navigated the treacherous currents of court politics with a skill born of long and painful practice. He formed alliances of convenience and discarded them when they were no longer useful. He crushed his rivals with the same impersonal efficiency with which he had destroyed Alan. He never allowed himself the luxury of friendship, only the utility of partnership. He married a daughter of a powerful courtier, a political alliance that brought him wealth and influence, but no affection. His home was a grand mansion in Istanbul, filled with the trappings of power, but it was as empty of warmth as the palace barracks had been. He was a man hollowed out, the space inside him filled with ambition and a cold, gnawing hunger for more. More power, more security, more distance from the terrified boy he had once been. He became the thing he was designed to be, a perfect instrument of the Ottoman state. His personal history had been erased, his emotional connections severed, leaving only a pure, unwavering loyalty to the system that had created him. He became known for his administrative brilliance and his absolute lack of corruption, not out of any moral principle, but because his only desire was to serve the state, the source of all power. He rose through the ranks, governor of a province, then a commander in the army, and finally, in his late 40s, he achieved the pinnacle of power short of the throne itself. He was appointed Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. He was now Murad Pasha, the second most powerful man in the world's most powerful empire. The boy stolen from a Bulgarian village now governed that village, and countless others like it. He was the one who signed the orders, who dispatched the officials, who managed the vast and complex machinery of the state. He even oversaw the div serm, the collection that fed the very system that had consumed him. He would review the reports from the provinces, read the numbers of boys collected, and approved the logistics of their transport to the capital, all with a detached, bureaucratic calm. What is the legacy of such a system? From the perspective of the Ottoman state, it was a resounding success. The div serm created a class of administrators and soldiers who were, for centuries, the bedrock of the empire's power. It broke the back of regional aristocracies and produced men like Murad Pasha, whose talent and ambition were harnessed entirely for the benefit of the central government. It was a brutal but effective tool of social engineering and imperial consolidation. Historians can debate its strategic brilliance, its role in forging a unique form of slave-based meritocracy. But this clinical analysis obscures a more fundamental truth. For the peoples of the Balkans, it was a wound that never healed, a source of generational trauma and enduring resentment. It was an act of systematic cultural violence, the theft of a generation's best and brightest. For every boy who rose to become a Grand Vizier, there were thousands who perished on the journey, who were broken in the barracks, or who lived out their lives in anonymous servitude. The system was not designed to create happy or whole human beings. It was designed to create cogs for a machine, and the human cost was deemed irrelevant. The story of Murad Pasha is the ultimate embodiment of this paradox. His life was a triumph of the system and a profound human tragedy. Publicly, he was the epitome of success. Powerful, respected, feared, a testament to the idea that even the lowliest Christian peasant boy could rise to the heights of imperial glory. His career was a piece of state propaganda made real. But what a private man, what the ghost of Stoyan. In the opulent solitude of the Grand Vizier's palace, surrounded by silk and gold, Murad Pasha was utterly alone. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when a mask would slip. The sound of a particular folk melody played by street musicians, a turn of phrase in a petitioner's plea, the sight of the distant, hazy mountains from his window. These things could sometimes pierce the armor he had spent a lifetime building. In those moments, a phantom pain would ache within him, a memory of a life he was forced to forget. He would see a vision of his mother's face, not as the grief-stricken woman in the village square, but as she was before, smiling, her hands dusted with flour. He would remember the solid, comforting presence of his father. These were not memories to be cherished, but slivers of glass working their way through his soul. They were reminders of the void at his core, the gaping hole left by the destruction of his identity. One evening, an old man stands before him, a petitioner from the Rodopi region. The man is pleading for tax relief for his village after a poor harvest. He speaks in Turkish, but with a thick, familiar accent. As he speaks of his home, of the hardships of the mountain folk, something in Murad Pasha cracks. For the first time in decades, he allows himself to ask, "What is the name of your village?" he asks, his voice hoarse. The old man tells him. It is not his village, but one very near it. On a reckless impulse, the Grand Vizier asks another question. "Did you ever hear what became of the family of Stefan, the farmer, whose son was taken in the Divserm many years ago?" The old man's face clouds with old sorrow. "Ah, the boy Stoyan," he says, the name a strange echo in the silent, opulent room. "A tragedy. His mother, Elena, died of grief within a year. His father, Stefan, became a broken man. He lost his land and died a few years later. The younger children were scattered, taken in by relatives. The family was erased from the land. The Grand Vizier sits motionless, his face a granite mask, but behind his eyes, a world is collapsing. He had told himself they would have forgotten. That life would have moved on. But it hadn't. He had not just lost his family. He had been the cause of their utter destruction. The system had not only stolen him, it had created a vacuum that had consumed everyone he ever loved. Murad Pasha dismissed the old man, granting his petition with a wave of his hand. He then sat alone in the vast, silent chamber as darkness fell over Istanbul. He was the Grand Vizier. He held the fate of millions in his hands. He was a success. He had survived. He had won. But as he sat there, the weight of his power felt like nothing more than the weight of a tombstone. The boy named Stoyan had been sacrificed to create him, and the price of that creation was not just one boy's soul, but the annihilation of an entire world. The palace was not a gilded cage. It was a mausoleum, and he was its most decorated corpse. The brutal machine of the empire had achieved its perfect work. It had taken a child full of life and love from the mountains and, after decades of meticulous effort, had succeeded in creating nothing at all.